According to the latest Jane's Defence Budgets data, defence expenditure actually returned to a stronger rate of growth in 2017, achieving 1.5%, which is slightly stronger than the growth we saw in 2015 and 2016. That said, we are expecting a huge increase of 3.3% in 2018, which will mean that global defence expenditure actually exceeds the 2010 peak and will now match levels that, in real terms, we haven't seen since the Cold War. What's driving this increase is a return to growth in the US and in NATO, and that's being enhanced by increased security concerns, but also enabled by improved economic conditions. In the US, there's the potential 4.7% increase in the FY18 budget, and a lot of that increase will be geared towards shipbuilding, missiles and munitions, and space-based systems, whereas the increases that we're seeing in Europe are primarily geared towards land vehicle procurement, military ground vehicles, and that's really quite in contrast to the trend that we're seeing globally. Eastern Europe was actually the fastest growing region in 2017, continuing the trend that we've seen over the last 2 years. And we do expect this huge growth to continue, although the other fastest growing region was Latin America. That needs to be taken in context of the fact that we've seen huge cuts in Latin America over the last 2 years, with high inflation, political instability, economic difficulties. So really what we're seeing in Latin America is a return to levels that we saw back in 2015 as opposed to new growth. In the wider world, growth returned to the Middle East and North Africa region as the oil price began to stabilise. And in Asia-Pacific, we did see a slight slowdown in 2017, but we do argue that the foundations for growth remain strong going forward. Pressure from the US to increase defence spending among NATO members is not a new development, but arguably the pressure from Donald Trump is far more assertive than in previous administrations. And some countries are responding to this pressure. We are seeing countries in Southern Europe implement double-digit increases to defence spending. But these increases actually began long before Donald Trump was elected. Eastern European spending began to increase in 2014 following the Russian annexation of Crimea. So we really saw growth return to that region long before the election of Donald Trump. Increases in Western Europe were primarily driven by security concerns and came in a little bit later, sort of 2015, 2016. So arguably, Donald Trump is encouraging these increases, but I would say that several countries would have to implement increases anyway, simply to cover those capability gaps that emerged since the global financial crisis. Over the last 10 years, defence spending movements in Europe were primarily driven by economic developments, and now that countries have returned to a sustained growth path and fiscal balances have improved, defence budget increases will now be wholly dependent on political developments, and indeed whether defence and security cooperation in Europe is successful going forward. Looking beyond NATO, growth in Asia-Pacific actually slowed this year to its lowest rate of growth since 2010, after experiencing robust growth over the last decade. And that was primarily driven by a slowdown in the growth of the defence spending in China and in India, but also cuts in the wider Southeast Asia region. And while we saw this slowdown in growth in 2017, we do argue that the foundations for growth over the next 2 years remain really strong, and we do expect that going forward, in the longer term, Asia-Pacific will continue to be the main driver of defence spending increases. Economic growth is still the primary driving force behind defence budget movements in Asia-Pacific, but we are starting to see strategic concerns play more of a prominent role. Chinese actions in recent years in the East and South China Sea, combined with the ballistic missile threat in North Korea and insurgencies in Southeast Asia, have all combined to prompted countries to increase their defence spending as well. Moving on to the Middle East, there was a reduction in defence spending in 2016, but the region did return to growth in 2017. Fiscal conservatism is still a huge concern in many of the markets, but as we've started to see security concerns develop in the region, defence spending was actually ring-fenced in many markets as the collapse of the oil price took its effect. countries chose instead to make cuts to infrastructure spending and to try and maintain defence spending, if not increase it by as much as it could in the last 2 years. These trends, combined with stronger growth in Western Europe and the US, mean that growth of 3.3% in 2018 is actually the strongest growth that we're expecting in over a decade.